All right, so you wrote a book. It's called Twisted My Dreadlock Chronicles, which is why we're having this conversation. Why did you feel it was necessary to write this book?
The book was an outgrowth of a journal that I was keeping. Um, and I'd been keeping the journal for a while. And then I decided on like March 8th, 1998, I think it was a Monday, to lock my hair. And I continued keeping the journal, um, but the attention that I was focusing in terms of what I was talking about in my journal really delved into not just that I was locking my hair, but why I was locking my hair and what it meant that I was locking my hair and how people were reacting to me locking my hair or thinking about it. Because, I mean, people may or may not know, you can decide to lock your hair. Your hair isn't ready to be locked immediately.
Mhm.
And so the first year was just sort of, or the first several months were just sort of obsessing over what in a sort of anticipatory way, what it was going to mean, what I was going to do, how I was going to do it. And over the months and years, it became something that I thought might be of interest to the larger public, the reading public.
Mhm.
And so it ended up being transitioning from a journal to a book manuscript and eventually to the book itself. And I just sort of felt like it was a sort of deep dive into the history of dreadlocks, the cultural history of dreadlocks, the way dreadlocks migrated from Jamaica to the UK way before it migrated from Jamaica to the US, and all those different ways that culture moves and works is really
Mhm.
interesting to me, and I thought it would be interesting to an audience.
So let me backtrack just a little bit, talking about the history of locks. Can you talk about the history of locks and kind of the intersection of Black hair and culture, and really just where locks actually started, back in ancient times?
Well, there's a very brief chapter, section in the book where I start talking about the fact that dreadlocks were found in, Egyptian tombs, and that, you know, they were discovered in Senegal, and that the Vikings, uh, and I end that brief section by saying, the question isn't who wears dreadlocks, it's more who hasn't worn dreadlocks culturally. Um, but the reality is in the present day, in the present moment, meaning the last couple hundred years, it's from Rastafarian culture in Jamaica. That's that's pretty much where it started around the 1940s, 1950s. Um, and then it sort of it's a compulsively attractive hairstyle. And by attractive, what I mean is that it attracts attention.
Mhm.
All of that attention isn't good, or all of that attention isn't is when people find that it arrests their attention, they don't always have good intentions. It doesn't always feel attractive in the way that we usually use that word.
Mhm.
I'm using attractive in a kind of, it attracts a sort of distinctive view that people have toward it.
Mhm.
And as a result, it was really interesting to grow my hair out. I was 40 years old.
Wow.
So I had a good 20 years as an adult before I got locked. And then I got locked. And then I'm, in my early 60s now. So it's been about 22 years. And the before and the after was interesting. The way that people responded based on if they knew me versus they didn't know me, or what their presumptions were if they didn't know me, and what their presumptions were if they did know me. It was just a
Hmm.
really interesting and fascinating experience. And I had a lot of fun thinking about it, writing about it, and then sort of putting it out there for the world to see.
I like that. I like that. I do want to go back to one thing. I know we kind of moved forward to like the 1940s and kind of when it became popular here and where it came from. I just want to be clear. So when in your book, when you talk about when it was discovered that some folks were wearing dreadlocks, what year was that?
The exact year,
Or around
I don't
about
know
what
that it
time?
was. Yeah, yeah. Um, and you're talking about in terms of the more
Egyptians,
recent.
ancient times.
Oh, that's 5,000 years ago. Yeah, that's a good minute ago. And what was hilarious about the Egyptians is that not only did they find dreadlocks, they found dreadlock wigs in the
Wow.
tombs along with people who had clearly worn dreadlocks, or what we're now calling dreadlocks. I'm sure they didn't call it that at the time. So it goes back thousands of years. The hair, when you are of African descent, hair curls out of your head. Depending on your ethnicity, depending on your race, it may grow out flat, Native Americans, people of Asian descent, you know. But if you're of African descent, the hair curls out. And what happens is it curls out and around
Hmm.
into a form that's called locks. If you cut it, it's going to be an afro. If you let it grow, it will lock.
Hmm.
And so it's been doing that for as long as there have been people of African descent.
There you go. The title of your book, you mentioned dreadlocks, right? Your Dreadlock Chronicles.
Yes,
And some
yes,
people feel a certain way when you refer to their locks as dreadlocks. Any
yes.
thoughts on that? And why you chose to refer to yours as dreadlocks?
I'm so glad you asked. The reason I'm glad is because I have to be honest. There is about me and the way I teach and the way I think and the way that I write. There's a bit of the provocateur. Um, I was absolutely aware that there were people, and I built into the narrative, it's right there in the book, that there are people who think that the word dread is pejorative, that it's negative. And I respect that, but I also respectfully disagree in that because I am interested in the sideways, I'm interested in the dark, and I'm interested in the provocative. I'm delighted that the Rastafarians chose that word to describe their locks. As I say in Twisted, the book, I say, they thought that maybe they would call them fear locks.
Hmm.
Um, they decided on dreadlocks, and part of the reason that they did is because they wanted to be outside of society. They wanted a physical, stylistic statement that said, I'm not of Babylon, which is their term for this sort of social whirl in which we all live. They're like, no, I'm not playing. And I want to be able to make the statement to anyone who sees me that I am outside. And if in fact that statement provoked dread, they were all for it.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
am too. My view of dreadlocks and its relationship to what people see when they gaze upon me and my body and my locks is far more nuanced and complicated than perhaps what the Rastafarians were thinking of when they basically wanted out.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
I love the tension. I just fiend on that tension between what's attractive to me and what's unattractive to others, and what I find fascinating and interesting, and what other people find questionable and repulsive, and everywhere in between. And so for me, the term dreadlocks was perfect. I couldn't have asked for a better term. But I do indeed spend a chapter in the book talking about this question of what it means to use that word and what it means to not.
Okay, okay. So you also just mentioned, the Rastafarians and the reasons that they chose to wear their locks, their dreadlocks. Do you feel like the reason that folks have chosen to wear locks, and we're talking about men in particular because that's what my story is about here this time around. I've highlighted many women prior to this story. But do you think the reason that people now are choosing to wear locks has evolved over time?
I do. I do. I definitely do. In my book, I talk about what I refer to as the Golden Age of Dreadlocks. And I put the beginning of the Golden Age of Dreadlocks right around the the late 1970s when 60 Minutes, and remember, at that point, 60 Minutes and any other network program had millions and millions of viewers, unlike today, where the media landscape is far more fragmented. At that time, there were 3 networks and an independent if you happen to be in a big city. And they did a story on the Rastafarians, and they mentioned the dreadlocks and they showed the dreadlocks. And from that moment, which I mark as the beginning of the Golden Age, to the early 90s, which I call the end of the Golden Age, which is basically the long 1980s. It was a hairstyle that both delighted people and freaked people out. It was a hairstyle that turned heads, but also created smiles, frightened children, freaked out grandmothers. I didn't get locked until the late 1990s. So you can tell there's a good bit of time in between the end of the Golden Age and when I got locked. Nowadays, you see grandmothers wearing dreadlocks all the time. They're no longer freaked out by them, which is not to say that they have been completely mainstreamed into society. They have not. But the relationship between dreadlocks and American culture is something like the relationship between tattoos in American culture. There was a time when a tattoo sleeve was an unusual, whoa, that person's really, and now you may like it, you may dislike it, but you're not surprised by it. And that's pretty much where dreadlocks are right now.
You know what? I want to dig into that some more, and I say that because the 3 men that I spoke to, they're all in different areas of their careers, right? Different levels of their careers, and part of the reason that we're doing this story is talking about Black hair and professionalism and dreadlocks being accepted in the workplace, and many of them are sharing personal stories about their locks not being accepted whatsoever at their places of business. A couple of them in the education area, some in nonprofit. And so I'm wondering, from that standpoint, do you feel like we've gotten to a place where they are acceptable, or why do you think historically, dreadlocks are seen as something that's not acceptable in the workplace?
Well, I don't see the term the workplace, I think, is too broad and too ill-defined to talk about where not just dreadlocks, but natural hair in general is either accepted or pushed back upon. For instance, I'm a college professor. When I started my first job, I didn't have dreadlocks. By the time I was up for tenure, I absolutely had dreadlocks. No problem. Plenty of professors with dreadlocks out there. And yet, if a little boy or a little girl locks their hair over a summer and goes to their private school, and their private school says, oh, you know what, we have a problem now. I know that's not the workplace, but it speaks to the sense that there are some positions, some corporate entities, some law firms that are going to have different clothing and stylistic dictates than others. And while it's not illegal to wear dreadlocks, there are going to be different approaches based on what industry you're in, how open that industry is to creative personal expression, and how less open or maybe even closed that industry is to creative personal expression. So yes, it's a problem when there's a tension between what someone inside of an industry wants to display that pushes back at that industry's expectations. But there are industries out there that it's simply not a problem.
And so I guess from that standpoint, do you think it's just it sounds like it's more just based on where you are? Because I mean, these guys are in education, some of them are in the nonprofit space, and it has been a concern that they've run into at multiple jobs. And so
Yeah.
I guess it's more so, like you said, whether or not the industry is willing, or that particular place of business is willing to accept that particular hairstyle or expression. Is that what we're getting
I,
at?
I, we're getting at that, but there's also the personal reaction that individuals who are in a position to say, you know, that hairstyle works, that hairstyle doesn't work. Some sort of person in some sort of, you know, managerial position. Sometimes that person's inside of an industry where it would otherwise be fine at another company inside that same industry for
True.
someone to wear their hair any way they want. And that personal individual who is a manager somehow feels like that's inappropriate for their company, even though industry wide, nobody cares. In other words, it's not just systemic. It absolutely is. It also shows up individually in a sort of one-on-one or one-on department or division situation as well. It's a little
Understood.
more complicated.
Speaking of complicated, right? Hair can be complicated. Can you talk about why it's about more than hair? Because of some feedback that I received, even when we started doing this series, which has been really successful, by the way, across Texas, across the country,
Good,
actually, because
good.
we've had a lot of folks airing it. Why do you feel as if, or do you feel as if it's more than just hair? If so, why?
It's way more than hair. Hair's a signifier. Um, and really, the idea that it's just hair is as absurd as the idea that clothes are just clothes. You know, when I was thinking about what I wanted to wear for this interview, I was going to wear a t-shirt, and then I decided, I think I better put a collared shirt on. There's a reason why I went through that process of what am I going to wear to appear in front of a camera. It's because clothes matter, and in the same way clothes matter, hair matters. It talks. It's a nonverbal call, and the way that people respond to it is it varies individually. It varies in terms of personality. It varies in terms of um, culture and preference and employment. And the idea that it's just hair, just blissfully, nonsensically naive, in my opinion. What I like to say to people when they say it's just hair, I'm like, oh, well, good. Why don't you just shave off all your hair, and I'll see you tomorrow with your hair completely shaved. And they always say, oh, no, 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 I'm not going to do that. I'm like, well, it's just hair. Why doesn't it just not be hair on your head? And most people, if they have a shred of sort of thoughtful engagement, will instantly realize, oh, there's a lot more going on here than just hair. It's deeply woven into who we are, who we think we are, what we think we're projecting, what we want to project. It's deeply layered and deeply engaged with both the personal and the political and the cultural. And it all is as a result of how we decide to wear our hair and what people think of it.
You think there's anything else historically that people need to understand about locks and people who choose to lock their hair, about dreadlocks? Is there anything historically that you believe, or feel rather, is missing from the conversation?
Hmm. Um, One of the things that I was speaking earlier about the kind of, you know, unnuanced phrase, the marketplace or the workforce. Um, in a certain way, dreadlocks and the hairstyle itself is is a hairstyle that is in need of a kind of deeper sense of what you mean when you say that. And what I'm referring to is the idea that if you look at my locks, anyone who has paid any attention to the hairstyle at all realizes that you can't have locks like these by just saying, I'm gonna have dreadlocks. I'll just let nothing happen to my hair. You know, it's the most deeply natural of all natural hairstyles. I'm still quoting sort of people who think this way, right? And to a certain extent it is, but my hair was styled to look this way until I was able to do it myself, and it was intentional in a certain way. Whereas all of us have seen, or I would imagine most people have seen, people who decided, let's just, let my hair do whatever it's going to do. And so you have a big, thick dreadlock like this, and you have another dreadlock that's about like this, and all in between. And it looks kind of scuzzy. You can tell that what they've done is never paid any attention at all to what their hair looks like. Personally, I love that style, but that was so far away from what I knew I could actually live with that this right here is a kind of happy medium when it comes to the panoply of possibilities that dreadlocks actually entail.